Hello all, this is NaveenPrabhu. Today we are going to look at the game between Vidit Gujrathi and Grandelius Nils. This featured in the round 8 of Tata 2022. We are not going to cover a Magnus games in round 8 because that game is so solid, and in the game they just started exchanging the pieces and goes into the end game, and they just drew the game in that way. But I like this game, so I want to show you this game. In this game, actually Vidit has just prepared a very well opening for Nils to play on this game, and I will show you what happened in the game. The game started with pawn opening. Vidit plays d4. Here he replaced back with knight to f6, and he comes to develops his kingside knight by playing the move knight to f3, and he goes for g6 and planning of putting his bishop to g7 and goes for a Grunfeld defense. But here Vidit has some preparations in the opening, so he placed the move knight to d2 and waiting for the bishop to develop in this situation. And actually, a few years back, Grandelius Nils always placed the move d5 in the situation, but in the recent past, he has started playing the move bishop to g7. So Vidit has been planned for that, and by his plan, Nils also placed a move bishop to g7. So now he didn't go for the c4 push or something. He started pushing this e pawn in this variation. This is known as East Indian defense, and here Nils just castles and he pushes his e5 pawn and attacks the knight, and the knight comes to h5 and he pushes the g4 pawn and attacks the knight once more, and the knight has only one square left, in that is he have to come to f4 square. Now he just puts his knight to e4 and attacks the knight on f4 with his bishop. Here note the point that the knight can't move back to e6, because if he does, it is seemingly good for white, because we can just push the pawn in the situation, and there is no moves for the knight. We have to counter attack our knight by playing the move f5. We can even capture the pawn here, and after he recaptures, we will just move the knight in the situation, and he can just move here. And note the point that the g file is open. We can just put our rooks and our queen can slide to h5 and start attacking the king in this way. There is so much pressure will be on the black side, but it is easy to play as a white in this variation, because the next moves the knight to g5 and queen to h5 and rook on g1 and threading some attacks on the king side. It will be so good for white to play. But in the game he just attacks the knight, counterattacks the knight by playing the move pawn to d5, and if he picks the knight here, he will just capture with the pawn. Just moves the knight back. As you see, this game has been only reached 3 times on the board. This is actually a rare one. This is what Vidit prepared for the Nils in this game. But here just Nils goes back with his knight as his knight is attacked. Here actually Vidit has a cool move to play in the situation, and this is what he have actually prepared for, because here actually he placed the move knight to f5. That's the move he have actually prepared for. Because the knight can't be captured, you may ask that what will happen if the knight capture. I have not seen any attacks here. But if the knight is accepted here, we can just capture back and attacks the knight. The knight have to move in the situation, and there is no more moves for the knight. You have to give up this knight, and we will just capture the knight here. And as you see, the g file is open for us. We can just put our rook and attack. I'll show you a sample line in this. We can take the pawn on e5. We can put our bishop and attacks the rook. And note the point, the bishop can't retrieve back to g7, because we can just put the queen to g4 and threatens the mate in 1, which is not stoppable in the situation. So bishop to g7 is not at all possible. We have to move the king here, You have to give up the rook. If he wants to save the rook like this, we can just start attacking the king by playing the move uh, rook to g1 check, and the king have to move to h8, and we can just start attacking the bishop. Bishop goes back. We can put our knight to g5 and threaten a mate in one. That is, we will take the pawn on f7. It is a mate here, and you have to accept the knight. We will capture back with our rook, and you have to ask for a rook exchange. Otherwise, we are putting our bishop and threatening something nasty in this situation. And we will capture and trade back, and we will capture the pawn on d5. And here you see the bishop has no good squares here. He can't put the bishop to d7, and he can't, if he puts his bishop to d7, he can't able to develop his knight, and this pawn will be hanged. So it is hard for black to develop his pieces, whereas in the situation the king is cornered in this way, and it is good to play as white because we are going to just castle and develop our bishop, and we want to put a rook on the g5 and start attacking the king here. It is so easy to play as a white in this situation. So in the game, he didn't accept the knight. He just started pushing the pawn to c5 and attacking the center here. Here Vidit just captured the bishop on g7, and he captures back with his knight. And in this here we can also capture with his king here, which will be somewhat good in the situation because it actually stops the bishop coming to h6 square. And maybe Nils just scared of these pawns here. We can also push our pawns forward and attack here. Maybe so Nils just thought of capturing the knight to g7 is okay in this situation. So he captures with his knight here. Now he just defends the pawn by playing the move g4, and as you see this actually reached only one time in the situation. In that game he just plays the move rook to g1. Here Vidit just saves his pawn by playing the move h3, and as of now this is the new move of the game. And here he just takes the pawn on here, and Vidit just didn't accept the pawn now. He takes his bishop to h6 and threatening something there. Yet he starts giving the checks because he don't want to keep the queens on the board. So Vidit also takes the queen in the situation. He captures back with his knight here, and he saves his pawn on d4 by his knight here. Now as you note, the pawn on e5 is also attacked, so Vidit just push the pawn to f4 and saves the pawn on e5. He just asks for a pawn trade. Vidit captures and he recaptures, and as you note that e file is open, so he may start attacking in few moves. So Vidit just calmly castle in the situation, and here he puts his rook on e8, and we just puts our knight to b3 and attacks the d4 pawn. But this is not a good move in the situation. Here we have to just put whether to put our rook on g5 and start pushing something on the king side, or we have to put our bishop on g2. If we put the bishop, it will just attack the pawn here, and maybe we can also ask for exchange in this situation. Let me show you a sample line in this variation. He may also try to push the pawn. We can't able to accept this pawn here because if he does, he will just capture back, and this bishop is trapped in the situation. This can't be good. So we have to capture this pawn here, and after he blocks, we can even trade the knight here, so that we are weakening this a7 pawn, so that we will get a pawn a pawn passer if the pawn on a7 is captured. So we are capturing the knight in this situation, and we can evenly play this game. It's a cool one, but here Vidit actually loses his advantage and by playing the move knight to b3. He is threatening the pawn on d4, but it's not enough in this variation. But here actually Nils has played a somewhat mistake move in this situation. He thought of defending the d4 pawn by playing the move knight to e6, but it is not that great in the situation. Here you have to place the move bishop to f5, and as you note that the bishop can't be captured. If does, that the knight captures back and the bishop on h6 is trapped, so it can't be good. And you can also try capturing the knight first, but here we have an intermediate move to play on, that is bishop to e4 and attacks the rook here. And after the rook moves, we can just capture the bishop here. And the bishop is wonderfully placed on e4, then putting the bishop on c8. It is a very good square for the bishop in the situation. But actually Nils missed this move. He just placed a move knight to e6 and defending his d4 pawn. But here Vidit just attacks the d5 pawn. As you see, the double pawn on the d file is so weak. This pawn will be fallen too soon. And Vidit just started attacking the d5 pawn, and the knight goes back here. Here Vidit just start pushing the f5, and before playing the bishop to g2, it is good to play the move f5, and after the capture we can just put the rook and something. But he thought of playing the move f5 in this position, so he pushes the pawn to f5, seemingly offering the pawn here. After captures, the bishop will come to f5. But after he captures, Vidit just puts the rook to f1. But in this situation, it is not good to put the rook. Whether you have to go for some g5 pushes here, but Vidit just puts the rook here. And in the game, he just puts the king to f7, and he thought of, after the g file is open, it's hard for his king to survive in this position, so he puts his king to f7. But there is an interesting move to play instead of putting the king here. Here we can also capture the pawn here, and after he captures, we capture this pawn, and after the bishop moves, threatening the rook to g1 check, and we have to move to h8, and the game can be continued like this. That is, which puts a safety for the knight. After he captures, we captures, and he puts his rook here, and it will be good to play. It will be a equalish game for both of us, and it is good. But here he just placed the move king to f7. It is not at all great move in this situation. Here he just captured the pawn here, and now he puts his rook to g8, and in this game he just puts the rook to d2 and defend this bishop. It is not at all good, because we can have an opportunity to move our bishop whether to h1 or to f3, which is good for the bishop, because the rook don't have to guard the bishop unnecessarily. So, but Vidit actually chosen to place the move rook to d2 in this situation, and here he just blundered the game by playing the move knight to e5. Instead of playing the move knight to e5, he can just have to capture this pawn here, and after Vidit capture back, we can just put our king to g6 and attack the rook and the bishop. And after he just got his rook, we can just takes the bishop here, and there is no mating attacks here, because after he captures also we can just block in the situation, and there is nothing to worry in this situation. But in the game he didn't capture, he just puts his knight to e5, and he just start capturing the pawns here. The bishop comes to d7, idea of connecting the rooks and in the situation. And here Vidit don't just doubles upon the e file, because he just creating some room for the king first, and maybe considering doubling upon the e file. Here Nils just having a short plan in the situation, just putting his rook on e file. If Vidit just casually placed the move rook to e2 in the situation, and in this move he can just give the knight to d3 check, and after the knight is captured, we can just capture the rook in the situation, the rook have to be captured, and we can just capture the bishop which is unguarded because it is only guarded by the rook. The rook is exchanged here. We can just capture the bishop here, and the rook has actually been on the put on the 7th file, and it is hard for white to defend in the situation, which is good for black in the situation. But this has not happened in the game, and there is also one more interesting variation. He can also put the another rook on the e file, and idea of putting the another rook to e2 and double up on the e file, but this is not at all bad. This is a worse than the other rook putting on the e file. Here he will just give the check, and after he captures, we can even capture the rook in this situation, and he can't defend with the rook because after he captures and the king captures, the bishop will be dropped in this situation. The king have to move, and we are actually exchange up in the situation, which is more than enough to win the game here. So considering this, Vidit didn't put his rook on the e file. He just puts the pawn to a4 and thought of moving the king and just going into the position in this way, that is b2, a3, d4, and in that way. He also pushes his pawns on the queen side. The bishop is doing nothing on the h6 square, so he takes back to f4 and attacking the e5 knight here, and he is ready to double up his rooks on the e file. So we don't want to put on the e file because of the knight checks here, so it just adds a support here, and also planning to put on the e file maybe with this support, and also guarding the rook on t2 in the situation, which may be helpful in later end of the game, as you see. And here he just puts the bishop to c6, and here Vidit just start moving his king here, because I have actually already mentioned that the king maybe go in this way and take on the pawns here or attack something there when the pieces traded out in the position. Here he just want to support the d5 pawn, and Vidit just moves the king to the a3, and the knight goes back. Here it is not at all good to place the knight back, and in this situation Vidit just thought for something around 8 minutes. As you see the time, Nils have 4 minutes on the clock and Vidit has 13 minutes on the clock, and in this situation Vidit thought for just something around 8 minutes and placed the accurate move in the situation, that is c4. He placed the move c4 because in this move it actually trades the pieces in the situation, and it is great for white to play in the situation because white has a superior advantage in the situation. So we have to start trading the pieces to simplify the game and going for a win in the situation. And note the point here, d captures c4 is not at all good. So because we can just capture here, and we have to capture the rook in the situation, otherwise we will capture the rook. After he captures, we can give this check, and after he captures, we will just pick this rook with our bishop. And as you note that we have actually a piece up in the situation, and also we having our bishop pair in the situation, and we also threatening the bishop to d5 check in the situation, which will be not a good one for him. But in the game, after the move c4, he didn't capture the pawn here. He just placed a move knight to g7. It is actually a blunder in this game. The good move is to place the move knight to c7 and got the d5 square. By taking the knight, he actually fails to guard the d5 square. That's what will just capture the pawn here. Oh, first he just captured the bishop here. Then after the pawn capture, he started grabbing the pawn here. And note the point. Oh, he can't capture back because we are going to give this check and attack the rook here. You have to give up the rook in the situation. He can't capture back, so he just puts a safety on the d7 rook, Now Vidit just captured the c6 pawn, and as I told you earlier that the rook is guarded by this rook. This may be a good one, I actually told. This is what Vidit actually had in the mind. So he thought that he will be able to face the two rooks here. So now he is able to capture the pawn because of the rook to f2 move. And in this position, Nils just resigned the game, and Vidit Gujrathi has just now scored 5 points, I guess, 5 points out of 8 games, and he is actually in the joint second place now with Anish Giri in the situation from round 8. And I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you like this video, hit the like button and keep supporting this channel, and thank you for your support. We'll meet you in the next video. This is Naveen Prabhu signing off.